But for them, this would be during the entire betrothal period, which is a time of preparation. So you're already legally bound to each other, right? So it says there, you might remember in Matthew chapter 1, that Joseph thought about divorcing Mary. In other words, to break a betrothal was not the same as for us breaking an engagement. Right. For us, engagement is like, yeah, we're going to do this. We set a date. We're moving towards it. That's the intention. But it's not legally binding. And you don't need to get divorced to break an engagement. Well, with betrothal, you do, right? But the marriage isn't consummated until then, the wedding ceremony. I say all that to say this. The picture of God with his people in the Old Testament is the picture of betrothal, which will one day be consummated in the wedding feast.
Welcome to this edition of Sermon Extra. We are here today at Whitefields Community Church. I am with Pastor Nick Cady, lead pastor of Whitefields Community Church in Longmont, Colorado. I am Stephen Pomeroy. I am the community pastor here at Whitefields, and we are happy to be with you today. We're going to talk to you about what happened in this last sermon. We're in Matthew chapter 25. We went from verse 1 through 30. So that's a common thing that we do here at Whitefields is verse by verse through the Bible. We're currently in Matthew, and we have entered into one of the most exciting two chapters in the book of Matthew, chapter 24 and 25. If you missed any of the previous sermons, you can go back. You can find us online at whitefieldschurch.com. You can listen to Matthew chapter 24, catch us where we're at here in chapter 25. And what we're going to do today is we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. There's two parables that we're going to go through, and we're going to say, all right, how do they apply to us, and what can we glean from them, even more than what we were able to talk about on Sunday. But definitely listen to the sermon. It's great. And then we'd appreciate it if you would comment and leave questions, but definitely like, and if you can, share the podcast, share the video. It all boosts everything in the algorithm and tells YouTube, tells Facebook that this is content worth watching, and we want to bring biblical content to you and to everybody else and help them be equipped for the work that God has called them to. So let's dive in. Let's talk about Matthew chapter 25. It started with the parable of the virgins, the wise and the foolish. And one of the things that stuck out to me the most that I liked, because I'm an Old Testament fan, and I love how the Old Testament supports the New Testament and vice versa. But you made the comment about the bridegroom coming for the virgins and what that would have looked like. But Jesus is anchoring this in the Old Testament. So just, rehash that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament that God's relationship with his people is that of a groom towards his bride. Now, I do think it is really important what I pointed out on Sunday, that Jewish weddings had a large betrothal aspect to them. So sometimes in the Old Testament, like in Isaiah, he will say, your husband is your maker, right? Saying, I am your husband. Well, somebody might say, well, a husband is different than a groom. And that's because in our way of doing things in the Western world in the 21st century, that's true. But it's not true in Israel. And this is actually really important because remember Jesus' parents? It says that they were betrothed, but they had not yet consummated the marriage. Joseph and Mary had not slept together, even though they were betrothed. And that's really important. So you had engagement, which was a semi-formal agreement between families, but that could happen even when the kids were prepubescent. That could happen, my son's going to marry your daughter, and we decide that early on. But then the betrothal would be when there's actually a legally binding ceremony that takes place, and from that point on, they're considered husband and wife and bride and groom for that entire period. In our case, we really only call them bride and groom like the day of, like during the ceremony, or maybe like shortly after. But for them, this would be during the entire betrothal period, which is a time of preparation. So you're already legally bound to each other, right? So it says there, you might remember in Matthew chapter 1, that Joseph thought about divorcing Mary. In other words, to break a betrothal was not the same as for us breaking an engagement. Right. For us, engagement is like, yeah, we're going to do this. We set a date. We're moving towards it. That's the intention. But it's not legally binding. And you don't need to get divorced to break an engagement. Well, with betrothal, you do, right? But the marriage isn't consummated until then, the wedding ceremony. I say all that to say this. The picture of God with his people in the Old Testament is the picture of betrothal, which will one day be consummated in the wedding feast. And that's why when Jesus said this, like the wedding feast is coming and all these things, everybody knew what that meant. It's the ultimate realization of the marriage of God and his people, when the two are united in love. So just a few verses for you to think about. Isaiah mentions it several times. It's a recurring theme, particularly in the servant songs. So from chapter 40 through 60 are times when Isaiah will rehash this idea of God as the groom or the husband of his people. And then he talks, as you probably know, that the people were unfaithful. The people have been unfaithful, and yet God is going to remain faithful to his vows. Okay, so then we have, and another example is like Hosea, right? Where you have Hosea being like an allegorical, lived out, prophetic picture of God with his people. And in this case, the adultery that takes place is spiritual adultery, which is in the form of idolatry. And we've talked about that before too, that idolatry is spiritual adultery towards your groom, which is the Lord, if you're a follower of Jesus. So another passage is Jeremiah chapter 2, which again rehashes that same idea. In other words, this was a common theme throughout the Old Testament prophets, that the relationship between God and his people is like a betrothal between a groom and a bride, and or husband and wife, which has not yet been consummated, but one day will be. And one of the best passages for that consummation is found in Isaiah chapter 25, one of my favorite passages. It says, on that mountain, Mount Zion, I will prepare a feast for all peoples, which is a really big deal because the word peoples is in Hebrew goyim, which means Gentiles. He's talking about not just the Jewish people. This is going to be a feast for the Jewish people and those from among the nations who have put their faith in Jesus, which, by the way, we're going to see a little bit more about that in chapter 25 in the coming sermon in verses 31 through 46, which is happening from the time of our recording this coming Sunday.
Yeah, and so, to me, this is the power of the Bible, right? In that you can see that it is one cohesive story. Yeah. You can't make this up, so to speak. You go from Isaiah and like the passage is like, hey, this is for the world, and then you come to this and you go, everybody has the opportunity to be part of this, to be part of the ceremony and the wedding feast. Okay, so this kind of even highlights that Jesus is going to go away and come back. And you touched on that, and so they can go back and you can watch the sermon and listen to it there. But the other thing that, to me, this speaks of, and very subtly, but maybe to the Jewish people it was very overt, is his deity. Yes?
Yes. You know what? I like to use notebooks. So I have a page in my notebook where I have started writing down Jesus's claims of his deity throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm actually going to go back and review the entire book because I just want to make like a list for myself. I probably will not catch them all, but I don't know of anybody who's done it. I'm sure somebody has. I'm not the first person to try and do something like this, but this was one of them. Jesus casts himself in the story as the bridegroom, which would have triggered the Jewish mind to say, so this guy says that he's God. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a big deal. But also, you know what? In chapter 25, there's going to be, at the end of chapter 25, another claim of deity. He is the one who judges the nations, okay? Which, again, is a role in the Old Testament which is carried out by God. So, yeah. Okay,
and so this may be a softball question, but I think it's worth.
Let's see if I can.
Okay, so this passage ends with, no man knows the day or the hour that the bridegroom is coming.
Yeah.
Okay. But does that mean that we can't know the month or the year? And is it ever a good idea to predict when Christ will return?
Okay. No, we don't know the month or the year. And I don't think it's, probably there are worse things you could do with your time, like, I don't know, drugs or crime. Yeah, but it's probably not the most profitable thing to do with your time. And I'll tell you why we can know that, because every time the disciples asked Jesus, so Jesus, are you coming back soon? Guess what? Every time Jesus said, I'm going to come back, I'm not telling you when he was here on earth, he's like, I don't even know when. But you know what you guys should be doing is not trying to figure that out, but be faithful with what I've called you to do. Yeah. Go be my witnesses. Go steward what I've given you to steward. And so I think we should take Jesus' advice.
Okay.
Like it would be malpractice, if you will, of Christianity for us to spend all our time trying to figure it out at the expense of faithfulness to the calling that he has given us.
Okay.
So
yeah, great answer.
But if you can do both, go for it. It'll be a practice in humility. I'll tell you that, because many people have made predictions and they have all been wrong.
Yeah. I think even this parable, the takeaway is be ready.
Be ready.
So you don't know, you can't know, you won't know, but you can be ready. You can be ready like it's today.
It could be.
So just be ready. And then that segue into the next section is the faithfulness element. So let's talk about the parable of the talents.
Yeah.
And there's a big question here, because we look at the parable of the talents, and these people were given talents, and then they were investing them in return, X number on their investment. And then the Lord comes and it's, well done, good and faithful servant. But there's this one guy who played it safe. And he's kind of like the main point. Well, don't be this guy.
Don't be that guy.
So let's talk about that. But first, remind them, how much is a talent and how much are these people dealing with here?
So I didn't go into all the details, but here's what it is. A talent is actually a weight of measurement. And it comes from the Greek word, which is some form of the word talent. I looked it up, and it was a measurement. So I guess it kind of goes like this. What's it a talent of? So a talent of gold is a measurement, the same measurement. It's like a ton, right? Like you gave them each a ton. Ton of what? Ton of gold? Well, a ton of gold is worth more than a ton of tin, right? But clearly he's talking about a lot of money. And generally it's held that a talent was worth about 20 years' wages for the average worker.
Okay, that's
a lot.
That's a lot. Okay, so then this guy that doesn't invest, he buries it, and then the Lord comes back and takes account, and he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant," to those that actually invested. But to this guy, he says, "What are you doing, buddy?" And so just talk about that. But then, with that, what if this guy did invest and he failed? What if he lost everything? Because that was his fear, his concern. And what if that happened? Would the Lord have said, "Well, good job, you lost everything"?
Yeah. Okay. So of course that's not told to us in the parable. And so I think a really important thing with parables is don't try to make them say more than they're saying. They often have a point. And every illustration, from an earthly perspective, breaks down at some level, right? Every analogy, so we shouldn't get too lost in the weeds with any parable, right? Trying to make every allegory fit more than what it's trying to say. So what's the point? The point is playing it safe is not actually faithfulness. The point is that being faithful means using what you've been given, not putting it in the ground and hiding it, but getting it out and using it. Now, you had asked me a two-part question. I was about to answer the second part, but remind me of the first part.
So what happens if he fails?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was the part I was going to answer. Okay. So, okay. Oh, you want me to tell
what if he loses everything?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here's what the issue is. If he tries and fails, I think, and we can get into details, but I think that the Lord still comes and says, "You were faithful. You tried."
Yeah.
That's what, he says he gave each according to their ability. Well, maybe that's why he didn't give him very much.
Yeah, and I also even think into that. This is a lot of investing that they're talking about, and we read this like he was given a talent. Mm-hmm. But even just the way you described that is like this is potentially 20 years worth of value.
Yeah.
And so we think, oh, one talent. That means he invested this one talent into one thing, and that thing failed, and he was afraid to fail. But I don't know a ton about investing other than just, diversification is a buzzword when it comes to investing.
Yeah, portfolio.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so, the chances of 20 years worth of wages being invested into one singular thing
very unlikely
is unlikely. And so to me, even in that, you have the opportunity to invest some here, some here, some here, some here, and maybe some of it does fail. But when it does fail, you go, okay, why did it fail? How did it fail? What can I do better next time? And so then the next series of investments, you've learned and you've grown. And so I just think of even the rest of these guys that were successful, how many times did they fail? And so I'll ask you, like in ministry, have you ever failed in ministry, or have you just been perfect, like perfect record?
Yeah, totally. We failed. I'll tell you some stories, man. We did some stuff when I was a missionary in Hungary. We started this camp that's just been very fruitful over many years. But that was like one thing we did. We also did some other attempts at things that were just huge flops. Here at Whitefields, we've done a couple things where it was like, well, we tried that. We're not going to do that again. That was like a huge flop.
Yeah.
Things that maybe work for other people, they don't work here, or maybe it doesn't work for us or in our community. I don't know. But I'll tell you that some of that like ministry stuff that we did, it was like, we're going to try a lot of different things, and we're going to see where the Lord's moving, in this community at this time with these people. What's the Spirit up to? And we want to discover that and get on board with it rather than just say, Lord, we're going to do this. Please bless it, right? Like we want to see what is God doing? Where's he moving? And how can we get on that train? And that's what we did with our camp in Hungary. But that's what we've done here in Colorado. We've tried lots of stuff. And some things have been amazing, and we just like, okay, let's do that some more, right? It's like this constant attempt to say, okay, God's given us a mission. How do we carry it out in our time and place? There's different methods for doing it, for reaching people. Like you think about, they had different methods in the early church. They weren't getting a rock band in a public square or something like that. They didn't have rock bands. But what were they doing? Well, they're feeding widows. Well, feeding widows, what does that look like for us? Should we literally feed widows, or does that mean that we should find the people who need help and serve them in Jesus' name? So my point is, that's called contextualization, right? How do we carry out those principles and the mission we've been given in our time and place? And where's God moving? Where's he opening up doors? So all that to say, yes, but cumulatively, we saw growth in the kingdom and in people's lives.
Yeah, and you're continuing to go and be faithful and grow, and you may fail again someday. Maybe.
Yeah,
but it's the investment in the kingdom that continues to grow and grow and grow. And so we used to have a thing back in Calvary Chapel, Kharkiv. We tell everybody, do not be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to fail. This is a place where if you're going to step out in faith, you just don't be afraid to fail. If you, what's the worst thing that could happen? You step out and you're trying to do something for the Lord, for the kingdom, and it's just absolute flop. Well, then we'll rally around you and we'll process, what happened and why, and we'll just move forward and we'll learn from that.
Absolutely. Think about it like this. In the process of trying to do those things that we did that didn't work well, there was a lot of prayer that went into those. There's a lot of time spent with the Lord. There's a lot of our team gathering together, and that was all very profitable. Time spent with the Lord, time spent trying to reach people, praying for people in our community. I have a friend who was thinking about closing down his church. He was a pastor, and I know that his whole thing was like, man, I've failed. And I was like, wait, you didn't fail. I mean, I don't know if you noticed this, but those 7 churches in Revelation, they're not around anymore. In other words, every church has a season and a life cycle. And you know what? Like, you had X number of years, people were baptized, the gospel was preached, people grew, they were discipled, they prayed, they gathered together and sought the Lord, they had relationships, and that's a lot of good stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's fruit that will last. And just because that church didn't continue doesn't mean that it was a failure. In other words, you spent the talent that was given you. You used it. And you know what? The the profit doesn't always look like dollars and cents, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes the profit, and that's a good question, like what does that profit look like in the eyes of the Lord? What is success in the eyes of the Lord? That's what we need to consider. And and I mean, I think maybe people watch and say, well, yeah, easy application to church, but what about my life?
Right.
And I would say, again, same thing, you tried to invest in something for the kingdom, and maybe there was some success. Maybe it wasn't, didn't double in impact or size. Yeah, people were ministered to, the gospel was preached, you spent time with the Lord. Mm-hmm. What's not allowed is inaction. Mm-hmm. That's not allowed.
Right. Yeah, and the other part is we kind of tend to be, subject to the moment and looking like right here, right now, and then the past, and like judging, it failed, and so I must not be successful, or only had a little return. Maybe, I grew in my relationship with the Lord, but didn't seem to go beyond that. Yeah, well, you're not done either.
Yeah.
Does the Lord have 10 more years for you, 20 more, 50 more years of you serving? And all of that is going to come into play later on in your experience and your wisdom and knowledge and how you depend on the Lord. So, these guys were found faithful or not when the Lord called it into account. Mm-hmm. And so when the Lord calls it into account, that's when you can look back and say, okay, now there's the life. But like in the moment, like even your friend at his church, like who knows what the Lord's going to do with him? Maybe he wants to send him somewhere else to plant another church, take over a church, take what he learned here and apply it over here. And so now, like, it is still going to multiply, and it will continue to multiply. So you can't be afraid to fail, and you just learn as you go and know that you've got years to serve the Lord if, that's what he's called you to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that faith is doing the things that you're supposed to do, trusting that if you do these things, God's going to take care of it, right? Yeah. Meaning you may not see the effect that you want to see, but you doing those things pleases the Lord. And I think that's the essence of faith. And he brings the fruit. One plants, another waters. The Lord brings the increase, it says in 1 Corinthians 3. Mm-hmm. So I would just say that to people too. It's like, okay, you may not see all the rewards, but not all the rewards are visible and tangible. Mm-hmm. And so, do those things. That's faithfulness. This guy was not faithful because he didn't do those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So let's just talk about success, and then we'll kind of wrap it up with this, because I think this is a good takeaway and application, whether it's ministry or whether it's life, whether it's family, whether it's running a business or just showing up to work. What constitutes well done, good and faithful servant? Is it, boy, I got the biggest pile of whatever, I got the most toys, the biggest retirement account, is that it? Is that how we measure success, or is it something else?
Yeah, faithfulness and fruitfulness. This is what I think you can get off base a little bit with some of it, right? Because sometimes people will emphasize the faithfulness part to the point of saying, to give themselves kind of like an easy out for saying that, there was no fruit that came from it. Like, you just kept showing up. And I would say the fruitfulness part should be considered too. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you're doing something over and over, you're being faithful, maybe. But maybe you're not being faithful if you're not adjusting. Mm. Sometimes you got to adjust, right? And say, okay, well, we're not seeing, this isn't really producing fruit. Mm. So maybe it's time to adjust our method or adjust an approach or ask for help, because the goal is to produce fruit and be faithful. So I always say those two things. But it's certainly not going to be measured in dollars and cents or asset lists or things like that. If you look at Matthew 25, there's a common thread that runs through each of these three parables. The parable of the unwise virgins, the parable of the talents, and then Jesus, this is not a parable, he's talking about the last day of judgment and what he will say to those who come to him. And you know what the common thread is? That there were some people who did nothing. And that is unacceptable, basically, right? So he says in the judgment, he says, I was thirsty, I was unclothed, I was unhoused, and you gave me these things. And they say, well, when did we do that? Oh, what you did for the least of my brethren, you did for me. But then he says to the other group, I was thirsty, you didn't give me anything. In other words, their sins were not sins of commission. They weren't, out there like poking him with sharp sticks or something. They were doing nothing. And again, what's the problem with the unwise virgins? They didn't do something. What's wrong with the talent guy? He didn't do anything. What's wrong with the people on Judgment Day? They didn't do anything. Doing nothing is a problem. So how is it measured? Faithfulness and fruitfulness. And I'd say faithfulness, number one. Fruitfulness, that should be something that we kind of like keep our eye on. And if something that we're doing isn't particularly fruitful, we can adjust. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll leave you this. Zechariah 4:6 says, whatever God has called you to do isn't going to happen by your might or your power. It's going to happen by his Spirit, the power of his Holy Spirit, who, if you believe in Christ, lives in you to empower you and to enable you. So don't be afraid to fail. Step out, invest in God's kingdom in whatever way he's called you to. Be faithful, and he'll take care of the fruit. And so we thank you for joining us on this Sermon Extra, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Definitely make sure you hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, leave a comment, and we'll see you next time.